This is the setup you had at the end of the fall. You've got a your vertebral column with the discs in it and the IK spline curve. I built this curve by working with the video that's included here, talking about positioning different levels of transverse sections and then creating circles that represented where the aorta was and then having the curve go through that. That's one way you can do that. A little easier way, but also a little more risk because you don't have quite the anatomical uh, accuracy, is you can eyeball this basically. You can create this curve, and like you did before, you could either mimic the curve of your spinal cord in the vertebral column in the let's say the lateral view here, and then again, like I said, eyeball the arch. Now, one thing I don't have it separate, but I think if I show you you can see where my sternum is. So you know when you create that arch that you've got to come off basically right from the vertebral bodies there, and you can only go as far anterior as the arch. And again, you can refer to the transverse sections to see how you'll see in several of the transverse sections how the juncture of the clavicle and the sternum is clearly indicated in the transverse section. So you'll know that your aorta's got to be, the arch is someplace there, and you also know from where the aorta is, its relative position to the vertebral column. The other thing is when you're done, you can always, if you don't like quite where the position of the curve is, you can always move things. You can change with the CVs. You can use the blend select and move quite a few points. So those are all things you can do. Now, once you have the curve, I'm going to hide that rib cage again. Once you have the curve, let's hide the vertebral column. We don't need that right now either. Once I have the curve, if you find that one of the things I found that makes this work the best, after creating the curve, whether you copy it or make it by hand, it's sometimes you really want the control vertex to be evenly spaced. See how they're evenly spaced along here? Now, that didn't happen when I made it. What I did was I created the curve. We did this last semester as well. I created the curve, and then I went under curves, and I went to rebuild, and I picked a number that was divisible by 4, and I said, please just rebuild the curve with that many CVs. And what that did is it not only rebuilt the curve, but it actually spaced each one of the CVs, with the exception of the first two. It spaced them nice and evenly. Okay? So once I've got the curve, the next thing I need is my circle. And I created the circle by going into the NURB primitive circle option box. And I asked it to give me a radius of 1.5 because the anatomy lesson told me that the curve was 3 centimeters in diameter. And my grid, I went back to the default grid, and I have a line every centimeter. So 1.5 plus 1.5 equals 3. So that's how I made sure I had the curve relatively correct. Now, once I had the circle, what I wanted to do was get the curve positioned on it, right? So to do that, I ended up sliding or using, you might recall that holding down the letter C. So I've got the circle selected. Let's just move it out of the way for a second. I've got the move tool activated. I'm holding the letter C. Notice how there's a circle comes up in the middle of the circle now. A little tiny circle in the center there. And then as I drag along that curve, it sometimes gives you a little hard time. I find it works a lot better in like one of the orthographic views usually. So what I'm trying to do is actually move. See, I'm just snapping along that curve. And it's giving me a hard time. There we go. Finally got it to go. Okay, so you have to kind of play with it a little bit. Now, I've also changed the angle of this. When my curve first came out, from the default, it was perfectly straight, horizontal. And I changed it because I wanted it to look somewhat perpendicular, if you will, to the long axis here. So once I've got the circle where I want it and my curve where I want it, I'm going to select them both and make sure they don't have any history on them. Okay, and I'm also going to freeze their transformations. And then I'm going to center their pivots. And then I'm going to select the circle first, hold the shift key, select the curve, and go under the surface menu here and look for extrude. So although you made a set of circles perhaps to help you figure out where to position the curve, we're only going to use one curve and one circle. One circle, the one starting right at the origin of the aorta, right out of the left ventricle there. And then we're going to use the curve the rest of the way. So this circle is going to just track along that curve, and it's going to create the surface you want. So I'm going to go get that surface command. I'm going to call extrude, and I'm looking for the option. And I'm going to use these settings. One thing I'm going to do is bump up the number of quads. All right. Now, by default, it's going to give you NURBS, so you have to change it to polygons. You want to make sure that you're asking for quads because, again, it will default to triangles. I suggest you also use count, which means you tell it how many faces it can have to make this model. So I use, again, a multiple of 4. And when I say apply, there you go. Now the problem is, oh, I'm sorry, one other thing too. I also, you notice here I said, in scale, I said 0.65 or 65%. And this is the reason. If you go again back to the anatomy page, it tells you that the aorta starts 3 centimeters at the heart, 3 centimeters in diameter, and then by the time it gets to its bifurcation at the 4th lumbar vertebra, its diameter is reduced to 1.75. So that's about actually 6%, but I'm making it just a little bit bigger. Now the thing with doing this is it's kind of mechanical. So you're probably going to anticipate having to go in and adjust some of the edges because you want to think about it logically. Wherever the vessel gives off, wherever the aorta gives off large branches like the celiac trunk, the renal arteries, it's going to lose mass. In other words, it's got to give some of its tissue into the vessel branches. In the beginning, in the thoracic cavity, it only really is giving back like the intercostal arteries and smaller vessels, so it's not losing as much mass as quickly. So really, it's not until it gets down into the inferior to the diaphragm, into the abdomen, and especially like this, like I said, the celiac trunk, and then you've got the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. So those larger branches are what's really starting to reduce. So you want to avoid letting this thing look like it's a piece of pipe or some kind of mechanical device where the change is mathematically perfect. I think that's one of the things we want to do. Now, the other thing is you can say is like, this is we've got a real problem here. That thing doesn't even look like the vessel. When it extruded, it seems to have kind of gone inside itself. So if you have this problem, what I'd suggest you try is click on the curve, and I'm just going to show right here. I'm not going to show me. Oh, maybe I have that turned off. Hold on. There we go. So you can see these are the endpoints. Notice that they're little dots. They're not at the beginning of the curve. Remember we talked about this last semester. A curve always starts with a square, and then the very next point, the next control vertex, is a U, the letter U. So what I'm going to do, see if I can fix this problem, is select that curve and then go into the curve menu and say reverse direction. And now that aorta gives me the shape I wanted. So I just wanted you to see that in case you ran across that using these settings and were wondering what's going on. So if you have this issue, that's probably the problem. Now, like I said, this is a little awkward right here. See that change? There's not really quite what we want. So what I'm going to do is go to the layouts, and I'm going to do 2 panes side by side. I'm going to make this my perspective window, and I'm going to show the polygon so I can see it in the perspective window. Oh, I do have it. I'm sorry. Let's try doing that again because I'm not sure it's oh, there we go. And I'm going to hide the grid because it's really unnecessary for me in this view. And let's just leave the lighting as default so it's a little easier to judge. And then this window, I'm going to change to the front view. And I'm going to turn off everything and turn on just the nerve curves, nerve CVs, and the nerve curves. And again, if you remember, we did this in the fall when we were trying to make the curve for the vertebral column. So now if I can simulate, if you will, my front view here in perspective, and I can reposition that anyway I want to make that look more natural. And if I don't want all of those points to move, I can just hit the letter B to get rid of the blend shape. But I don't really mind. I think it's better to have not a kink, but a little subtle movement in there because that's more natural to me than what the vessel would look like if we don't. Now, see, you can see my point from earlier. See how it's perfectly scaled. So you may find that you want to go in and after you've done the vessels, you may want to go in and you decide that you want to scale or change things just a little bit to get things to grow up. Okay? So that's how I would start the artery.